Every Thursday morning, just after 7, a flatbed truck turns down a gravel road in rural Kentucky and stops at the edge of a 40-acre property. The driver doesn't honk. He doesn't need to. The woman who owns the land is already standing on her porch, coffee in hand, watching. What he unloads isn't lumber anyone wants. Thick, uneven oak slabs, bark still clinging to the edges, some warped, some cracked down the center. The kind of wood a commercial mill calls waste, the kind that gets burned, chipped, or buried, and yet, week after week, she lets them stack the slabs along her fence line like it's nothing unusual at all. Her neighbors have started parking near the mailbox just to watch. Nobody understands why a 60-year-old widow would want truckload after truckload of wood that a multi-million-dollar mill couldn't sell. Nobody understands why she never complains, never negotiates, never asks for a single dollar in return. What they don't know is that she isn't collecting waste. She's collecting time. If you love stories about ordinary people finding extraordinary opportunity in places no one else thinks to look, you're in the right place. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. This community has grown because of people like you. Now, let's find out how a pile of discarded oak quietly became a six-figure business. Her name is Diane Holcomb, and the property has belonged to her family since 1962. She inherited it from her late husband, Walter, a man who spent 30 years driving a feed truck and never once touched a woodshop tool in his life. When he passed, most people in town assumed Diane would sell the land and move closer to her daughter in Lexington. Instead, she stayed, mowing the same fields, paying the same modest taxes, and turning down 2 separate offers from developers who wanted to subdivide the property into lots. She wasn't a carpenter, she wasn't a businesswoman. To most of Hartwell County, she was simply Walter's widow, a woman people were polite to but never curious about. She didn't drive a fancy truck or attend the Chamber of Commerce meetings. That underestimation, it turns out, was the first piece of luck she didn't recognize at the time. Nobody expected anything from her, which meant nobody was watching closely enough to discourage her either. The lumber mill belonged to a man named Russell Tate, who ran Tate Brothers Sawmill 2 miles down the highway. Russell didn't know Diane personally, but he knew her land had a long dirt easement, perfect for staging overflow material. The mill processed thousands of board feet a month, mostly for flooring contractors and cabinet shops, who ordered in bulk and expected every board to match the last. When a log came through with wide, irregular grain near its center, often the most beautiful part of the tree, it simply didn't fit standard production. Buyers wanted uniform boards, predictable grain, straight edges, live edge slabs. The ones with the natural curve of the tree still intact were considered a liability. They required longer drying times, careful handling, and buyers willing to pay for character instead of consistency. Most commercial mills don't have the patience or the market for that kind of wood. So Russell proposed a standing arrangement. Every week, instead of paying landfill fees for slabs nobody would buy, Tate Brothers would haul them onto her easement, and in return, Diane could keep and use as much of the wood as she wanted. It cost the mill nothing, freed up space at the sawmill, and gave her an oddly endless supply of free hardwood for some use she hadn't yet imagined. She said yes, not because she had a plan, but because Walter once told her, "Never say no to free wood. You'll find a use for it eventually." She didn't know yet how right he'd be. For the first few months, the slabs simply sat there, slowly losing moisture in the open Kentucky air. This is where Diane began to learn, almost by accident, the difference between air drying and kiln drying. Kiln-dried wood is heated in controlled chambers to reduce moisture content quickly, often within days. Air drying takes far longer, sometimes a full year per inch of thickness, but it tends to preserve more of the wood's natural color and strength. Oak she'd later learn, is particularly unforgiving. Its dense grain structure makes it prone to cracking if dried too fast, and it behaves differently depending on whether it's cut flat-sawn or quarter-sawn. Quarter-sawn oak, cut perpendicular to the tree's growth rings, reveals a distinctive rayfleck pattern that furniture makers prize, but it's also more time-consuming to produce, which is part of why mills avoid it for cheap, fast inventory. Maple, by comparison, dries faster and moves less, which is exactly why mills favor it for production runs. Oak's stubbornness is precisely what makes it rare, and rarity, Diane was beginning to understand, often hides behind inconvenience rather than scarcity. None of this made sense to Diane at first. She simply noticed that some slabs split apart within weeks, while others, stacked with small wooden spacers between layers for airflow, stayed solid for months. She was learning the hard way, through failure, exactly what professional kilns are built to control. Her first real attempt at building something came nearly a year later. She decided to make a coffee table for her own living room, sanding a slab by hand for an entire weekend. When she finally applied a store-bought oil finish, the wood blotched unevenly, soaking up the oil in patches instead of an even sheen. She nearly gave up there, but an old neighbor, a retired cabinet maker named Cecil Whitmore, happened to drive by and saw her sanding dust scattered across the porch. Cecil had spent 40 years building cabinets before arthritis forced his retirement. He looked at her uneven finish, didn't criticize it, and instead said something she'd remember for the rest of her life. "Wood doesn't lie to you, Diane. It just tells the truth slower than people do. You listen long enough, it'll tell you exactly what it wants to become." He showed her how to seal raw oak with a thin sanding sealer before finishing, how grain direction affects how stain absorbs, and how patience, not talent, was the real skill separating good furniture from amateur work. Her second table came out better, though the edges were uneven from an improperly sharpened blade. Cecil taught her how to true an edge using a router and a straight guide rail, a technique she practiced for weeks until her cuts stopped wandering. Slowly, mistake by mistake, her work tightened. A year after that first ruined finish, she completed a dining table for herself that finally looked intentional. Rich amber tones, a smooth hand-rubbed oil finish, the natural live edge polished instead of rough. A friend visiting for dinner, a school teacher named Marcia Doyle, asked if Diane would build one for her family. Diane said yes, charging barely enough to cover materials just to see if she could do it again. She could. Marcia's table led to a photograph posted online, which led to a phone call from a woman in Lexington, then another from a young couple renovating a farmhouse outside Bardstown. Diane wasn't advertising, she kept no website, ran no ads, and never once called herself a business owner. She was simply finishing each piece with the same unhurried care Cecil had taught her, and customers noticed the difference between something mass-produced and something built with attention. One client, after picking up a finished console table, told her flatly, "This feels like it has a story already." Diane realized almost without meaning to that the story was exactly what people were paying for. The turning point came almost 3 years after that first truckload of slabs. An interior designer from Nashville named Renee Castellano was searching for a unique reception desk for a boutique hotel client and stumbled across photos of Diane's work. Renee drove out personally, expecting a small hobby shop. Instead, she found stacks of curing oak, a converted barn workshop, and a woman who spoke about wood grain the way sommeliers speak about wine. Renee placed an order for 6 custom pieces. It was the largest commission Diane had ever received, and it terrified her. She underestimated how long 6 large pieces would take. Working alone, she fell behind schedule, losing sleep and nearly missing the deadline. It was Cecil, now in his 80s, who reminded her of something simple. You don't have to do everything yourself to do it right. She hired a local craftsman, a younger man named Jake Sutton, who'd been laid off from a furniture factory 2 counties over. Jake brought speed. Diane brought judgment. Together they finished Renee's order on time, and the hotel commission led to a second one from a boutique chain expanding across 3 states, coordinated by a buyer named Tom Bridger, who specifically requested the Oak Woman from Kentucky. Within 4 years of that first delivery, Diane's workshop, still standing on the same easement where Tate brothers once dropped their rejected slabs every Thursday, had grown into a business generating well over 6 figures annually. She still sources material from the same mill. Russell Tate still calls her personally when an oak log produces wide, irregular slabs nobody else wants. It's Thursday morning again. A flatbed truck turns down the gravel road, just as it has for years. Diane stands on her porch, coffee in hand, watching the driver unload thick, uneven oak slabs along the fence line. Nothing about the wood has changed. It's still rejected, still imperfect, still considered waste by everyone except her. What changed was Diane. Her story isn't really about lumber. It's about what happens when someone refuses to dismiss something simply because it looks rough, unfinished, or inconvenient. Value rarely announces itself. It waits patiently beneath a surface most people never bother to examine. As Diane often tells visitors who ask how it all started, echoing a truth George Washington Carver once put into words. When you can do the common things of life in an uncommon way, you will command the attention of the world. She didn't find a hidden fortune in oak. She found it in patience, in failure, in an old cabinet maker's quiet wisdom, and in the discipline to keep showing up every single Thursday until the world finally noticed what she'd seen all along.